I'm John Dervage with Our Revolution Colorado Springs. With me is Jillian Freeland, who is running for United States House District 5. Can you tell me a little bit about your campaign and specifically what you're running for?
So I'm running for Congress in Colorado's 5th District. I'm a sociologist, a former midwife, and fierce mama to two beautiful little girls that I'm determined will have a brighter future with more rights, not the path that we are currently set on. So I'm going to go to Congress and fight.
Yeah, and this district has been primarily held by Republican for quite some time.
Only ever held by Republican, yeah.
Yeah, so...
And only ever held by male Republican as well. So definitely not representative of the district.
Yeah, and so, I'm sure there's a long list of things, but just kind of in a nutshell, what really separates you from Doug Lamborn, who's currently sitting in that seat?
Well, my background in the medical world gives me a lot of perspective into our healthcare situation. I have fought with insurance companies. When I ran my small business, one of the biggest struggles I faced in providing women's health care was trying to make insurance companies pay for the services that women are, putting their premiums into.
For sure.
And so, if a system was functioning properly, we wouldn't be fighting to get people care.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too where people have to put in so much effort, themselves. They pay these premiums, but then they also have to stay on the phone for countless hours just to be able to get that coverage that they are apparently paying for.
Right.
I mean, in Medicare or medical treatment and insurance that's a big topic in this election. Just looking at the different platforms, even amongst the Democratic candidates, there's a lot of differentiation. There's a term, Medicare for all. A lot of people are using that, but they kind of mean different things when they say that term. They're not specifically talking about single payer. What does Medicare for all mean to you specifically?
It means getting rid of barriers to using the care we pay for. And the major things that I see as these obstacles would be deductibles. They only exist and function very well to get people to put off getting their health care. I've done it.
Yeah.
In fact, I saw an ad yesterday that said, "Have you met your deductible this year? It's a good time to get dental work." And I was like, Are you kidding me? And I saw a statistic that 1 in 4 women puts off health care every year because they haven't met their deductible. And what that means is missing out on cancer screenings. It means, the only potential time they could be screened for domestic violence and get help with that, or with mental health care, or accessing addiction services. Those annual appointments are important, and when we skip them just because we know it'll cost us several $100s out of pocket, that's when we end up with people in the emergency room with the flu, and then they get a $5,000 bill.
Yeah. And you mentioned,
and hope that hospital was in network.
Exactly, yeah. You have to have all these considerations when your only consideration should be just getting the treatment you need to survive or for your family to survive. There's all these mental hurdles people have to jump through when they have an accident, am I going to be able to afford this? And that's just barbaric, especially in this country.
I was at the climate strike a couple weeks ago, and at the end of the event, one of my friends missed a step and fell backwards and hit her head. And the first thing she said was, "Please don't call an ambulance, I can't afford it."
Yeah.
And actually, I think, Tammy, you took her to the hospital.
Yeah.
That's insane to me.
Yeah. I mean, and you mentioned mental health as well. It's something that, looking at people's platforms, even on the Democratic side, that they're not covered, not specifically saying that's going to be covered in their health insurance or their medical package. So, is that something too that you believe should be covered under a Medicare for all system?
Absolutely. Well, and this ties into our criminal justice system because prisons are actually the number one provider of mental health care in this country, and we should not be waiting until people are at a crisis level or are living on the streets before they can access mental health care.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of people discussing too, how can we pay for this?
We are paying for it.
Yeah, when it comes down to it, we're paying. It's the most expensive. We have the highest cost of any modernized country, and people are paying the price for that in several ways, including having to ration their insulin and all those sort of things. So, yeah. So specifically looking at bills that other politicians have put out, is there any sort of bill that you agree with specifically, or is there any sort of anything you change with some of the bills that have been put out? I'm thinking specifically on Bernie Sanders' bill that he outlined in the Senate?
Well, universal health care is something we have to move to. It's the humane thing to do, and it is also fiscally responsible, because as it stands, we're spending, in 2017, we spent $3.68 trillion on health care, and the estimates say that going to a Medicare for all single-payer system will bring that cost down to about $3 trillion a year. And so, and by changing the way we pay for our care, we can expand access, and that way people get that preventive care, so they, can get their flu shot and not end up in the hospital with the flu.
Yeah.
Because the flu's a big deal. It kills tens of thousands of people every year.
Yeah.
That's where that adage comes in: the ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure. And in terms of the wide variety of healthcare reform that people talk about, I understand what politicians are trying to do when they say Medicare for all who want it, but to me that seems kind of like a dishonest way to transition to Medicare for all. If we know that Medicare can provide the level of care that people need, then why mess around and try to sneak people into it with the idea that will provide such good care that eventually people will just choose not to use private insurance anymore and will put them out of business. Why not just be honest and move forward quickly instead of trying to take an incremental approach? And I think that applies to a lot of parts of government work. When we try to take an incremental approach, it doesn't change things for people who are in desperate situations. It also doesn't inspire the public. We are facing a pretty big crisis about the public's confidence in our government. And by sticking with the middle-of-the-road, incremental approaches to everything, people are not inspired to get their butts off the couch and go vote.
Yeah, for sure. Getting the status quo is no longer working for the majority of Americans in a lot of ways. And I agree with the idea that in order to get people out and voting, confidently and enthusiastically, you have to, make these big changes to the ways that they, the things that they really care about, which is medical treatment and climate change and things like that. So, shifting gears a little bit, looking at, I think the big story in the last couple weeks or so, and this, applies directly with being in the House, is the impeachment of Donald Trump. I mean, that the process is starting. What are your thoughts on that? Is this first off, is this a offense that the president's being claimed to or being trying to be impeached for? Is this actually an impeachable offense in your opinion?
He has committed several impeachable offenses, and the way that he has responded to these accusations and the evidence that is piling up. It's just really a continuance of how he has lived his life. He has enjoyed an extreme amount of privilege because of the family he was born into and the quantity of money that has always been available to him. So he has been able to buy his way out of the many morally questionable decisions that he has made. Everything from being accused of sexual assault to being just openly racist and having been sued for racist housing process choices, and to bragging about assaulting women and making statements like, I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and get away with it. This is the way that he has lived his life, and so he expects to continue on in that way as a president. And so he continues to take actions that are not moral and that do not serve the American public. They serve himself. He's making a lot of money off of being president, and that is against our Constitution. And it is also the constitutional duty of the House to investigate. Now, that being said, Mitch McConnell has been very clear that he intends to not carry out his constitutional duties, and in fact, I believe he is campaigning now on saying that he will not hold the president accountable. And boy, I'm rooting for Amy McGrath. And Trump is not alone in obstructing our country's progress. He has been enabled by many individuals, and I really doubt that I will be in the House in a time that an impeachment inquiry would continue on.
Yeah.
From a numbers point, if Trump wins, there's no way that a progressive like me would get elected at the same time. And so this is going to be a matter of everybody putting their boots on the ground and putting their money where their mouth is, because if we want to see change, if we want to see different kind of politicians elected, everyone has to get involved.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think something that's been kind of surprising to me is, there was a pretty big, they talk about the blue wave in the last election cycle, and there still hasn't really been this push for impeachment or even investigation into his, these alleged activities, really until just recently with the Ukraine debacle. Why do you think that the leadership on the House was trying to, focus on other things or not necessarily putting this on the forefront of their agenda?
I think there are two important components to this. For one thing, the American public is so fatigued with these continuing abuses.
Yeah.
And a lot of it has been kind of not understandable to the typical person who isn't a complete dork about politics and watches it compulsively. And so with the most recent kind of blow up over the last week with the quid pro quo with Ukraine, I think Nancy Pelosi has recognized that most Americans can understand what's going on now and get behind a formal inquiry. And I will say they have been kind of quietly investigating in the way that they are constitutionally obligated to do, but now it's on.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. The other side of that is the Republican response. I mean, there are some Republicans that are going out there and saying that we do not agree with these actions, but there's a large, I'd say, majority of Republicans that are still standing behind President Trump and the actions he took, saying this is perfectly within his right, nothing was wrong, and talking about Mitch McConnell not wanting to even really mention this in the Senate. Why do you think that they're defending this president? And would they have done that? I mean, we know the answer. Would they have done this same sort of approach if it was another president on the other side of the aisle? But what do you think that they're actually gaining anything from taking this stance of not trying to at least investigate potentially impeachable offenses or treasonous offenses?
I think there's a really strong tendency to pick a team and stick with it, and Republicans have so far been successful with just towing that party line, and I hope that their consciences are going to start to kick in and they will get brave enough to step out and choose country over party. And I will say that my opponent is still all in for Trump. In fact, he was just appointed to Colorado's Get Him Elected Again commission, and he is very enthusiastically supporting the president regardless of what offenses he commits against the American people.
Yeah, which is really unfortunate because the Republican Party today is definitely not even, I'd argue, the Republican Party of 10 years ago.
No.
And you think about someone like McCain who ran, and then someone in his audience raised up a kind of a racist remark against President Obama, and McCain shut that person down, saying
right.
no, we don't want to have that rhetoric. I mean, that's not even something that exists anymore on the Republican side with the current president.
And Lamborn has been in office for well over a decade, and he very publicly called Obama a tar baby. And so racism and protecting parties and profits instead of people has been their status quo for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think what's happening now is they have stepped so far out, and that America is finally going, okay, this is too far. We cannot afford to just not vote anymore or not call our representatives anymore. Mm-hmm. It matters that they're not holding town halls. Because there's no hope for accountability if our politicians aren't willing to stand in front of the people that they represent.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of Republicans, especially who are in seats that are considered safe like this one, it is a safer political strategy for them to quietly sit in the background and keep doing things that undermine democracy, because for so long the public has not been paying attention. We're too tired from working 60 hours a week and trying to raise a family and pay the student loans and just get through life. And I suppose my hope is that the extreme swing that we have taken in the last couple of years is waking people up. I mean, honestly, I don't know if I would be running for office right now if things weren't so bad. Mm-hmm. I mean, if the popular vote had won out, we would still be in that space where things are good enough. And so I guess in that way, I'm grateful for this extremism, because a lot of people who otherwise would not be engaged are.
Well, and it's definitely like, I'd say people always say like, well, both sides are just so extreme now, and I'd argue that the left side of the aisle has just gone more to the center over the last couple decades.
Agreed.
To the points where like the extreme isn't necessarily any more extreme than it was, like especially if you think back all the way to like the 1940s, like with FDR and then New Deal politics he had then, and the ramp up into World War II. I mean, they were a lot more left than how modern day liberals are left, right? So I also agree with that. The idea that and also the idea too that populism is so important in getting people out and voting, because again, populism is getting that politics out of the these big corporate interests and things like that. So to follow up on that, what are you doing or trying to do to try to keep money out of your campaign or keep money out of politics in general?
Well, in the future, what I'd love to see is publicly funded elections. One of the hardest parts of campaigning for me is the amount of time that I spend calling and begging for money.
Yeah.
But in the current system, it's not possible to win a race without raising money. And also, this district is... more people live in Colorado's 5th Congressional District than in the entire state of Vermont.
Yeah.
I can't knock on 540,000 doors. And so being able to reach people through mail, being able to reach people through media, these are things that cost money. Yeah. And there have been a lot of things around the campaign industry that have shocked me. How much it costs to have software so that you can keep in touch with your voters and your donors and send emails about, hey, I'm going to be at this candidate forum tonight, come join me. All of these things cost significant amounts of money, and because I am very firmly middle class, I can't self-fund. Yeah. When you look nationwide, the average for a congressional campaign is $1.3 million. Now, my opponent in his last few elections has spent about $650,000. That's two times the value of my home. Yeah. And the very practical mama and millennial in me thinks about how many people could eat for the amount of money that I'm raising to do this. Yeah. And a friend of mine who is a financial advisor, he said, Jillian, I'm going to donate to your campaign because I support what you stand for. But as a financial advisor, I feel I need to point out that you're trying to raise $1 million to get a job that pays 170 something. Shut up, Kenny. Yeah. The money is a means to an end. And that being said, I have to raise all this money, and I refuse to take the kind of traditional money that tends to pour into campaigns. And so I will not accept any fossil fuel money. Mm-hmm. I will not accept pharma money or health insurance companies' money, because the job of government is to protect people and prioritize their well-being, not the profits of people who can dump a lot of money into elections. Yeah,
and I think we've seen, in the recent statistic that came out for $3, I mean, with grassroots campaigns, thinking of Warren's and Bernie Sanders' campaign for president, I mean, they raised close to $50 million, which is pretty good amount of, especially considering past elections. That's huge, and they're not taking in corporate donations as well. So yeah, I think that there's this sort of drive to get people more involved, and I think, like you said, like seeing something as extreme as a Donald Trump presidency is really getting people out and realizing they need to start making a difference. So moving on to our what's going on tonight, and I don't know if this is going to get posted, so it's probably most likely late news, but there's a climate forum going on in Colorado Springs. We're trying to bring in local politicians to talk about climate change, what their platform is, and what they can do. Can you give me a little bit of a summary on what your position is on climate change and your plans on how we combat that?
Well, I understand climate change and the science behind it. This really shouldn't be a debate over is it real or not anymore. We have decades worth of data. And I've mentioned before, I'm a pretty big dork. I love data. I try to make my decisions based on evidence.
Yeah.
The evidence, whether you're talking about sunny day flooding in Miami or the ice caps that are disappearing at a terrifying rate, or the softball-sized hail that we're seeing. And the evidence is overwhelming. And one of the really neat things about the last couple of years and people getting engaged is the success that grassroots pressure is having. Here in our community, we burn coal in the middle of our downtown, which is tied to a lot of really terrible health outcomes. Everything from asthma and allergies to increasing rates of miscarriage and dementia in the areas that coal is burned.
Yeah.
And so the people of Colorado Springs have been showing up to really boring government meetings, because that's what government should be. It's just really boring processes, and making comments and saying, we don't want to burn coal in the middle of our town anymore. We want to see investment in renewable resources. And so Colorado Springs Utilities is responding, and they are installing almost 200 megawatts of solar power in the next year. And I would love to see some proposals for wind turbines. They live out on the east part of town.
Yeah.
It is windy out there, and wind power is actually now the cheapest in terms of installation and maintenance. And there are some turbines that are so fantastic that one turn of the turbine will power a house for an entire day. The technology is just bounding forward, and it's because people are demanding it. Colorado Springs Utilities is also depending on rooftop solar and improvements in construction to reduce the quantity of electricity that we need to produce on the utility scale. And this is important because for security, microgrids are actually better for our communities. And we have 5 military bases here. National security is very important. And so through increasing the number of ways that we produce energy and having a demand for utility scale batteries, we're moving forward and making progress. In terms of rooftop solar, which we have a bank, I love. I have a really geeky little app on my phone that I can look at how many megawatts of power we've produced. We're just about to hit 10, and we've had it for a year now. And the federal tax credit of 30% that was in place made that affordable for us. Our energy costs did not actually change because of the way we structured the purchase, and because of that 30% federal tax credit. Now that is going to go away. Next year it will step down to 26%, and by 2022 it will be gone. So I would protect that federal tax credit. There are a lot of rural areas and a lot of people who are trying to move to a more sustainable off-grid lifestyle, and by incentivizing that change, we can allow people to make progress on their own individual level. My mom lives in an off-grid tiny home. And it comes with its own challenges, but as the technology increases, as we demand it more, it's going to become more and more feasible. And
I think it's one of those questions too about how much do we as a society actually need to change. Just thinking about like the way that we drive and the way we get around this country. I mean, there's no surprise that, or it's probably not a surprise to anyone that there's a pretty insufficient lack of public transportation in Colorado specifically, but I'd argue in the whole country. What needs to happen there, in your opinion?
Oh, I'm a big dork for this one. It really frustrates me that Colorado is continuing to invest in roads. There's something called induced demand, And what that means is as we expand traffic lanes, more people are going to be willing to drive. And so because of the cost of living in Denver, a lot of folks have moved down to Colorado Springs, and we have thousands upon thousands of people making the commute up to Denver. Now, my partner is in auto insurance, and driving is one of the least safe activities that we do. And if we increase access to really quality public transportation by investing public dollars in it, it will make people safer. It will also reduce our carbon footprint. And I think that it's really important to have quality public transportation options within the city as well, not just a commuter train that goes between our two largest cities in the state. And what I mean by that is dedicated bus lanes in town so that buses always run on schedule, so that people can reliably know that their bus isn't going to get stuck in traffic, and so they will make it to work on time. And another thing that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint, many retailers have expanded their delivery options. And so if you think about it this way, say 10 of my neighbors need to make a trip to Costco. Instead of having 10 individual cars, by using delivery services, we have one truck that takes an efficient route to go and deliver all of those packages that we need. And so it just comes down to government investing in technology and processes that look to the future, that aren't just, well, this is the way we've always done it. It's hard.
It's too hard. We don't want to do it.
I know, right?
It's like that's not an American way.
No, and the demand for hybrid cars has increased. I'm mama to two. I'm currently driving a Honda Fit, which I call my bubble. It's a teeny little car. It gets 36 miles to the gallon. And I have finally given in and said we're going to get a little bit larger car. My mom is like, get a minivan. I'm like, no, Mom, I can't. And so we're on the wait list for a hybrid crossover, and we've been waiting for 2 months. Yeah. So the demand for high efficiency vehicles is increasing. And we decided to go with a hybrid instead of a plug-in electric because the infrastructure is just not there yet.
Yeah.
And so my hope is through some work and government process in the next few years, then we will be able to convert to a fully electric vehicle because this district is big. I drive pretty long distances to tour, and I actually have been to every county in this district and found that we're all facing many of the same struggles. We can't afford our homes, we can't get to medical care, and education is expensive, and we're not providing it at the level that people need.
So the other thing with climate, I think in general, is the idea of how much do we need to spend, or how much effort do we need to put into addressing this issue. I mean, obviously, I think on the Democratic side, there's a lot of agreement that it's very, very important, if not one of the most important considerations. But there is differences in proposals based off of how much cost there's going to be, or how much of how comprehensive of an approach are we going to be, or are we going to take. What are your thoughts on that? Like, is there a limit on how much we should be spending or kind of focusing on to make it more, politically intriguing to people on the other side of the aisle?
I mean, stuff costs money, and I call it an investment for a reason, because it's not something that we're just going to continue dumping and literally burning money in the middle of our town. If we invest in renewable forms of energy and utility scale batteries, then it doesn't have the continuing costs that fossil fuels do, just physically buying the coal to burn it. And so in that way, it's a smarter investment. Additionally, it creates thousands of jobs. Wind energy is currently creating and sustaining more jobs than coal is. And as we continue extracting fossil fuels is going to cost more and more. The deeper you have to dig to get coal out, the more it costs. And there have been communities that are both physically and in terms of health devastated by the extraction industry. So whether you're talking about earthquakes caused by fracking, or black lung, or mountains that literally have been topped to extract, why wouldn't we move to a diverse and renewable way of generating our energy? The coupon clipper, the person who's looking forward to one day paying off student loans, I see this as a smart investment. We also need to remember that the majority of polluting that's going on is done by industry. And so while we talk about putting solar on our roofs and driving fuel efficient or completely electric cars, we have to remember that the majority of climate change drivers are generated by big industries, and that's where like cap and trade policies come in. And I've heard people talk about, if the moral argument doesn't reach people, then we need to make transitioning off of dirty fuels profitable. And so when it costs more to continue polluting, companies will invest in cleaner energy and producing things in a non-polluting manner.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, there's some proposals out there to create millions of jobs, and there's also this idea too that people that work in the industry, the coal industry and fossil fuel industries now, can have a just transition to a job that most likely will pay more, definitely be better for their health, and is overall probably more sustainable economically for their families. Is that a message that you think has been properly applied to people in Colorado? I mean, I'm thinking specifically on how one of the last proposals last year about trying to limit fracking and try to prevent that from occurring in places where people live and where school districts are. I mean, that was voted down. Do you think that there's a messaging conflict going on, or that there's some obviously outside interests trying to prevent change from happening?
Lobbyists with good messaging and a lot of money to throw at paying canvassers to go knock on doors and say, ooh, boy, panic, panic, mayday, mayday, change. It comes down to talking about things that are in a way that is accessible to people. Not talking about hydraulic fracturing and making it not possible to understand by most people, because in this social media age, we don't have the attention span that we used to. And for the most part, if you don't reach someone within 10 seconds, they're not going to listen to anything else that you have to say. And so when we talk about these big changes, we need to do it in a way that speaks to people, that doesn't purposely drown them in jargon. And when we reach people at that level, then they're more willing to embrace and advocate for change. And I will say, I talked about those boring government meetings that people have been turning up and making public comments. The last two Colorado Springs Utilities public comment periods I went to were standing room only, and a couple hundred people in these rooms. The overwhelming majority of people who spoke in favor of renewable energy. And specifically at the last one, there were two gentlemen who said, no, we need to keep on coal and fossil fuels. Everyone else who spoke in that hour and a half that they allotted was asking for renewable energy. And Colorado Springs Utilities is kind of neat. It's owned by the people. And so they are accountable to the public. And in response to grassroots pressure, they're looking at renewables. And this is why it's important for people to realize that together we have power. That when we either unionize our workplace or show up for protests or go visit the local offices of our representatives, especially when we speak together, we can't be ignored anymore.
Would you be for banning fracking in all areas? We
don't need to frack, and it is harmful. We have a candidate for Senate here in our state, Mr. Hickenlooper, who will not be attending the climate change forum being put on this afternoon, because from a strategic standpoint and because he has historically supported fossil fuel industries, he is not attending.
Yeah.
And he has a nickname for a reason. It's Freckin' Looper.
Yeah.
And it just speaks to that incrementalism that has been the strategy of the Democratic Party for so long, that it has harmed our ability to make change. And it has also made it not exciting for people to support politicians, and that's part of why we're so dependent on raising money instead of speaking to people, is because we have shifted our model of selecting politicians to whoever can raise enough money.
Yeah, and I think with that comes with the idea too that only politicians need to fit a certain mold, right? Like the old politician you think of, typically a white man. That's overwhelmingly that's what we've seen in American history. Last election, I think, was a big wake-up call to show that that's not necessarily the case. And we mentioned before, Trump has motivated a lot of people to go out and run for office locally as well as nationally. What are your thoughts on that movement? Like, obviously, it's a big part of you said why you're running. But overall, is that is enough being done really in that sense to get representation out and getting people, getting more fair, diverse, electorate?
Well, I mean, right now we have just shy of 24% women in Congress, and that is a record number.
Yeah.
And the way that elections are set up automatically disadvantages women and people of color in a few really easy to see ways. For example, the Federal Election Commission only in the last year decided to allow campaign funds to be used for childcare. And in this country, it is just the norm that women are expected to do the majority of childcare. And you can see this in things like when Beto O'Rourke was interviewed and talked about his wife raises the kids with a little help from him. Or when my father-in-law was here recently and asked my partner, well, what will you do when Jillian's in D.C.? And he was kind of taken back for a second and just said, more. I'll raise my kids.
What do you mean? What are the options?
I'll keep doing laundry. I'll keep washing dishes. We make the household function.
Yeah.
And the assumption that homes can't operate without women is just wrong. It's false. And another thing that has been frustrating and illuminating is the electability discussions that we're having a lot. And to me, if we want people to win, we must support them. And so not talking about things in terms of, well, Hickenlooper has the most name recognition, so we need to stick with him. If you want someone's name recognized, talk about him.
Yeah.
Share their stuff on social media. Hold a meet and greet for them so that people in the community have access to their potential representatives. The ones who will win are the ones we lift up.
Yeah, and I think also coming through the idea too that people bring in different perspectives. Like obviously, this is something that you see in managerial classes and things as well, where if you have too many people of the same mold, they have the same ideas, and really nothing fundamentally changes, which I would argue has been the case in politics for quite some time.
Well, and it really speaks to the motivations for seeking this kind of power. When there are certain parts of this state that women have taken the majority in local government, and men who have been in these positions of power for a long time are really intimidated. And it speaks to a fear that perhaps women in power will treat men the way that they have been treating us.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, gentlemen, but equality is not oppression. And so making conscious decisions to look at people beyond just they have the most name recognition or they already have power is not going to cause change.
Yeah. The idea that you need to basically be already in that position, have that experience. I mean, experience, especially for a politician, can come from a lot of different forms. Especially, again, if you're trying to represent, it really depends on who you're representing. So.
Well, and as a medical provider myself, I bring a perspective that is just not in Congress right now. And it's very clear because we have a lot of politicians making statements about women's bodies and women's health care that are factually incorrect. And whether it's states like Missouri that are mandating women be sexually assaulted through an unnecessary internal exam before they can acquire abortion services. How do we get there? And it's because people who don't understand healthcare and don't understand or care about women's bodies are the ones who are making decisions. And there have been a number of really just awful things said and done. Whether it's, a woman who says, there's if it's a real legitimate rape, the woman's body has a way of just shutting conception down. Give me a break. Right? And that also speaks to the failure of our sex education system. And I was recently speaking with an advocate for LGBTQ youth, and he said he saw a study that showed when women have consent-based, comprehensive sex education, they are 50% less likely to be assaulted in college. Just understanding that it is okay to say no, and the expectation that that no will be respected is huge. And in this country, it is estimated that 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted, myself included. We have to address this. And when we have a man who has been credibly accused of sexually assaulting dozens of women, who is on tape having described assaulting women, talking about going into dressing rooms when he knew young women would be nude, this just speaks to what we accept as a society. And this is part of why we need women in Congress in every level of government, from school board to senators to presidents, maybe one day. And I think too, like, there's definitely a trend you see with even the people that he's nominated. I think the Supreme Court, the Justice Kavanaugh allegations, and I think a lot of very credible allegations. I mean, that was something that was in the news cycle not too long ago. I mean, again, you talked about short-term attention spans, but there's still these allegations coming forth for a Supreme Court justice who obviously has a very important role over, protecting a woman's right to choose. And who is about to hear cases relitigating abortion rights. And what shocks me is that so many politicians would rather have a discussion of the ideology behind abortion and choose candidates based on which team they pick, rather than doing what the evidence says actually reduces abortion. And it's real easy. You educate people and you give them contraceptives. Right now in the Senate, there is a bill, Senate Bill 930, that is co-sponsored by Cory Gardner, our very own U.S. Senator, that sounds really great until you have a health care provider dig into it. And I have spoken extensively with his office as well as Joni Ernst, the senator from Iowa, who proposed the bill. And they call it increasing access to contraceptives. But what it does, it makes birth control pills over the counter. Now, think about when you buy Tylenol. Your health insurance does not cover that. So I called and I asked, will health insurance continue to cover contraceptives? No. Easy answer they gave me. And so these supposedly pro-life politicians ignore what the evidence says actually reduces their supposed goal of reducing abortion. And instead they would rather place a huge financial burden on women. And what they also don't take into account is oral birth control is not only taken to prevent pregnancy. There are a lot of women, at least 10% of women, who suffer from a condition called endometriosis, which causes very heavy bleeding, a lot of discomfort, leads to infertility, and the medication that is prescribed to deal with this condition is $250 a month. And so, because women have to take this continuously throughout the year to control the condition, the burden ends up being close to $4,000. And this is on top of usually at least $10,000, sometimes $20,000 in premiums that they're paying a year. Don't forget the deductible.
Yeah.
Don't forget the co-pays. And going back to that annual exam that women need to get to renew their birth control pills, that is when they get screening for cancer, when they get screening for sexually transmitted infections. It is one of the only times that they may receive access to domestic violence counseling and services. And so it is a huge disservice to women and would not continue happening with healthcare providers in there writing laws that are informed by the actual experience of women.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think too, it's like part of it, is the rising cost is also, address something that isn't addressed in all Medicare for all plans, which I think honestly should be. Because, that's something too, you talk about, the rising costs of those treatments, and, it's, when it comes down to it, they're necessities. And also mentioning the idea too of like, a more fundamental approach to not just teaching, in sex education, teaching the idea of abstinence only.
It's not effective.
Yeah,
it doesn't work.
Growing up, and that was my high school experience, and I didn't have any sex ed in college, but in high school, it was all abstinence only. And that's a very old way, and it was like the sort of thing too, is just showing, almost like demonizing it as like something that's not natural, something that is, something that we should just try to avoid at all costs, when it's like, obviously, like you said, not effective, and it's just going to lead to more issues, so.
Well, and it was actually a formative experience for me. My upbringing was pretty religious, and my dad and stepmom made the decision to pull me and my sisters all out of sex ed. And they kind of created an activist. Oops. Because I'm the kind of person that you're not going to tell me what I can't know. So I marched myself to the library and ended up knowing more than my peers.
Well, that's the thing that's sad too, is a lot of it is expected to be taught by the parents. And it's like, some parents don't want to have those conversations or aren't comfortable with it through, through religious reasons or other reasons. And that's not doing a service to the children that need to have this knowledge.
Especially when the parents did not receive quality education themselves. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people can't even name their own body parts. And it actually contributes to a lot of the abuse that happens. And makes it difficult to prosecute individuals who commit sexual assault, especially on children. Because if a child cannot describe their body part, if they use some silly other name because their parents aren't comfortable using the word vulva or penis, it harms those children further, and they have no hope of getting justice, and the perpetrator continues on doing what they're doing. And so, this is one of those many issues that is tied to other issues, and we can't think that the abortion debate exists in a vacuum that is separate from sex education and health care. It's false. It's dishonest. So I had my oldest daughter in 2015, and Bernie was really speaking to issues that impacted our lives. Our student loans, the cost of housing, minimum wage not being enough to sustain a family. And so he was the first time I did anything more than vote. I wrapped my baby up in a little bunny suit and put her in the carrier, and we went and knocked on doors for Bernie. And I was completely shocked to my core when Trump was elected, especially right after admitting to sexual assault. And so after a couple weeks, when I was like, okay, I have to do something, I started getting involved in activism. So I joined Indivisible, and which really gave me an understanding of the power of grassroots pressure. And started organizing rallies and protests, and we held a couple of with or without you town halls up at the library, because no matter how many times we asked for town halls from our representatives, they were too scared to come stand in front of us. And one of the most powerful things that I did was organizing constituent visits to local offices. Because a lot of people are too nervous or don't know that they can walk into those offices and say, you know, hey, this issue really matters to me. I'd like you to hear me out on it. And so on this particular day, a group of veterans, mostly women, visited Congressman Lamborn's Colorado Springs office. And the office manager told me that it is not Doug Lamborn's job to represent everyone. And after I picked my job off of the floor, I kind of, you know, I decided to come for his job. and as a person who is willing to be responsible to the public and willing to change my mind in the face of new evidence, I'm not going to say that I will agree with everyone, but I will listen to everyone. I will stand in front of people and be held accountable for the decisions that I'm making. And so there will be no telephone town halls where everybody is muted and I don't have to hear, you know, that was wrong or you're hurting my family. And so then we won't have politicians like Doug Lamborn who get away with lifting up hate groups and having the majority of their agenda set to reduce the number of rights that people have, whether it's honoring Focus on the Family and its founder on the congressional record, when this is an entity that has been classified as a hate group that actively works against women's health care rights and the rights of people to love who they love. And so if you want representation that protects people, we have to elect different people. And that means thinking outside the box and getting involved in ways that make you uncomfortable, whether that's, you know, phone banking or knocking on doors is the best thing you can do. It's the most effective way to reach people and say, hey, this candidate is awesome. Have you heard about them? This is what they stand for. Will you support them? And that's what we're on track to do. And so in a time that feels so dark, we have to take back our power as people together and stand up and demand change. Because they're not going to do it if we don't say you have to.
No, I agree. I think that is the definition of grassroots activism, is people going out there and doing whatever they're comfortable with, whatever they have time for, and trying to make a difference. And I agree, just off of personal experience, talking to people, even people who you don't agree with or don't agree with you, is still incredibly beneficial, because you still get outside perspectives. And I'm always surprised by how much of an instance there are of agreements more than disagreements. Like, everyone can agree that healthcare in this country is a problem that needs to be addressed, or that, you know, there's this corporate greed that has taken over politics that needs to be addressed. So just going out to speaking to people and being at least a listening ear is incredibly important. So and it's shameful that that's no longer a common trait of politicians, or at least past politicians. So
and calling y'all out, America, it's laziness on our part as the public. You know, we can't afford to be complacent anymore. We literally have 10 years before climate change has passed the point of no return. My kids won't even be adults then. You know, they're 1 and 4 right now, and I demand that they have air they can breathe and water they can drink in a world that isn't going to, you know, basically shake humanity off and say, y'all blew it. Let's give it back to the birds and the bees.
Let's look for a little brighter of a future. So
let's work for it. It's not just going to happen by magic. We have to work for it.